Hi guys, welcome to episode 8 of the Knitting Expat Podcast. Today is it will be the 4th of May when this uploads, 2015. I'm pre-recording this before my trip to London. And this is going to be a special episode. This is an episode of my firsts, my knitting firsts, as it were. So since I started the podcast, I had a lot of people getting in touch with me saying how they were quite, what's the word? I don't want to say impressed, that's not the right word. How they're interested to see how much I've progressed since only having been a knitter for a little over a year. And that they're interested to know, how I got started, how I learned, because I'm completely self-taught, just a bit more about the process of how I got to where I am. So I thought, why not do a Knitting Firsts episode? So I can explain it all, and you guys will have an episode to watch in between whilst I'm away. I'd like to say thank you, first of all, to everyone who's joining us today for this episode. I appreciate each and every one of you. It's incredible that there are so many people who are interested enough to subscribe and follow on Instagram and join the Ravelry group and watch, basically. I'm just astounded every week that so many of you are that interested in what I have to say. So thank you for taking the time to sit down and join me today. My name is Mina. Sorry, I don't know if I introduced myself yet. My name is Mina. I'll be your host today, as is the same every week. And so yeah, you can find me on Ravelry as Mina86. The Ravelry group is the Knitting Expat Podcast. You can find the show notes at knittingexpat.wordpress.com, and you can find me on Instagram as Mina Phillip, and all of those will be linked down in the description box for you. So let's dive right into it. Whilst you'll be watching this, I will be in London. This is all, as I mentioned, pre-recorded, and I just didn't want there to be a massive gap between episodes, because I figured actually I'm hoping I'll be able to do a podcast whilst in London, but if I didn't get to do one whilst in London, then there probably would have been like a 3-week gap between episodes, and I didn't really want that. But so I'll be sharing today is you'll probably just see a little bit massive pile of knitting over here. I'll be talking about some of my early projects, what I learned along the way, what learning resources I used, where I've bought yarn, because I know a lot of people have been interested in where I've actually been able to get yarn. A bit about the knitting community in Dubai that I was part of, and that has been very instrumental to my growing obsession with knitting. And just in general throughout, I'll be talking about knitting mistakes I've made and learning experiences in general. And then I'll move on to why I've decided to start designing and what techniques and new things I would like to try in the future. Starting off with the basic question, why knitting? Why did I decide to start knitting a year ago? Well, quite simply, I've always wanted to learn to knit. It's always been something that I've been interested in. I've always been intrigued by it. It's always appealed to me. I don't know why I didn't start sooner. I just didn't. I'm not really sure why. Kind of wish I had now. But yeah, so the real catalyst for it was that Perry, my husband, started working away from home a lot. We were living in Dubai, and at the beginning of last year, he started working away, like 5 days a week he was away, and he'd only be home at the weekends. And after a couple of months, I was pretty much bored out of my mind. So one evening after work, I just drove to the craft shop, in the one and only craft shop I knew of at the time in Dubai, picked up a ball of yarn and some needles, got home, got onto YouTube, and started with something. So the very first project I started was actually from a blog. It was a blog post that I found for knitting a very simple cowl. And it wasn't even a cowl knit in the round, it was knit flat with super bulky yarn on 9mm needles, so I think that's US size 13 needles, and you're supposed to like add a button to it to hold it closed at the front. And I didn't follow the pattern exactly. Start as you mean to go on. I could probably count on one hand the number of times I followed the pattern exactly as written. And I, obviously, in my infinite wisdom, being the first time I was starting any knitting project ever, decided that the number of stitches to cast on wasn't the right number of stitches to cast on, and thought it wasn't enough. So I added stitches on the cast on row. Lo and behold, it turned out way too wide, because obviously I didn't know any better, but for some reason thought I did. So what was supposed to be a cowl turned out to be this wide, and that was just too wide to wear around the neck. So rather than ripping it all out, because I'm not a fan of ripping out, I mean I will do it if I have to, but if I don't have to I won't. Oh, that was the other thing. So I actually probably started it on this side, and it was all garter stitch, so it was knit every row. And I didn't do too badly. I don't think I added stitches at any point. I don't think I this is the seam where it's all joined. I did the mattress stitch seam. You can't really see anything right here. This bit. Didn't add any stitches at any point, which was good. And then I very quickly realised that one ball of yarn I picked up was not going to be enough, so I went back and got two more. I got one in white and one in, well, like a creamy colour, and another one of the red. And then I striped them. And I very quickly learned about striping and this issue with the striping. And I kind of figured that one out for myself, because the pattern was written for just one colour, not two. And I mean, I tend to, when I alter patterns, one of the things I usually alter is I alter the colours. And if a pattern is written for one colour, a lot of the time I will stripe it. So, because I like it, I like the effect. So I very quickly learned about striping. And so yeah, like I said, I finished it. It was too big to be a cowl. So what I did was I seamed it up the back. I seamed it up at the join, at the ends. And then I seamed up the bottom. Then I sewed a little garter stitch thing, length, I guess. It was only like 3 stitches or something. I sewed that on to make a little loop. And then I'm not entirely sure how I did this. I think I just knotted it about a bajillion times, or a lot basically. I sewed that on, and it's now a little bag, and that kind of, once there's stuff in it, this holds it shut. And so this now lives in my bookshelf and holds some balls of yarn. Yeah, so that sits in the bottom of my bookshelf. You can't see the bottom there, it's right at the bottom. And this was my very first knitting project ever. It's supposed to be a cowl, I turned it into a bag. Like I said, start as you mean to go on, huh? That's number 1. Then the next few things that I have to talk about, I don't actually have them anymore because I've given them away. One was a hat, which actually turned out terrible. I actually still have this hat, I just couldn't find it to show you, but I will insert. I will add a picture of it in the show notes. It was supposed to be a twisted stitch faux cable hat. This is where I learnt about twisted stitches and knitting through the back loop, and then realised I knit the whole hat knitting through the back loop rather than through the front loop, so none of the faux cable pattern really showed up at all. Then I knit quite a few headbands, like small headbands. A friend of mine has twins, and so I was knitting headbands for her kids. And the thing was, I hadn't really started anything big because, one, I didn't know where to find yarn in Dubai. So the only yarn I could find was relatively low quality, or not necessarily the best quality. And we also had a trip to Iran planned in April, which was like 3 weeks after I started knitting. So I got online on Amazon and I'd ordered some knitting supplies like needles and a couple of books, I think. No, one book. And then I knew I could find yarn in Iran, because I knew that my family in Iran would know where to go find yarn. So I was sort of holding out, I guess. So I didn't do much, but I did actually, one thing I did start and finish before we went to Iran was a lace shawl, stole, kind of like, it was a wide shawl, quite long. And I knit that up. It was like a mohair yarn that I found, and I used 4 strands, because I'm crazy. 4 strands of mohair. I knit the whole thing. Sorry for grabbing, I forgot to grab these earlier. Knit the whole thing on a pair of these ridiculous plastic needles, these 7mm plastic needles. Yeah, like I said, I was too eager and didn't know any better. But I knit it, whole scarf length shawl on this. And oh, it was full of mistakes. It was full of so many mistakes. There were sections, there were like random little bits of garter stitch where I'd obviously forgotten to purl on the wrong side for not even a whole row, just a part of a row. I have no idea. Anyway, I finished it, and because there were so many colours in it, it actually didn't look so bad. And my mum loved it, so she got it. And then last Christmas, she actually brought it to Dubai, and I seamed up the ends, so now it's a cowl, and she wears it all the time as a cowl. I'll insert a picture into the video here if I can. Okay, that should be long enough for that. And so hopefully you've seen the picture, and if you haven't, there'll be one in the show notes as well anyway. And yeah, oh, and the other thing I did, and this was actually, I guess, my very first thing that I designed to some extent. I found a free pattern for a simple vest top thing, a vest cardigan, I guess. I can't remember what it's called, and it was designed, the pattern was written in garter stitch, and the patterns also said, well, you can always change it up and do whatever stitch pattern you want. I was like, okay, I don't want to do garter stitch, I want to do something fancy. So I came up, bear in mind, like, I'd only been knitting 2.5 weeks at this point, maybe 3, when I started it. I started knitting, again, I knit the whole thing, I think on these needles as well, it's these 7mm needles. No, I think it was 5.5mm needles. And I used this tweed yarn, this stuff, that I used to make my beans the cat. And this is the colour. I'll put a picture of it in as well to show you. And yeah, so I designed it and it had a smocked stitch on the front sides, and on the back it was all smock stitches with a large chunky cable running up the middle. Basically, I went completely off track with how the pattern was written. I took the general schematic and basically worked out my gauge and figured it out from there, really. So I was not afraid of doing knitting maths at all from the very beginning. I guess that's probably a good thing, because I've realised I do a lot of knitting maths over a lot of my projects. It's probably a good thing. I actually quite enjoy maths. It's very, I find there's a definitive right and wrong answer with maths, so I've always enjoyed it for that reason. And I don't really talk about my job very much, but maths is a big part of my job, so I guess it's a good thing I'm not scared of a calculator. Yeah, and so that top in the end, it didn't work as a vest. I didn't like how it sat. It was too snug as a vest, and if I'd buttoned it up, it would have looked weird. So I seamed it up, the front, and it became like a vest top. And when my auntie came over last October, she tried it on and it fit her perfectly. I mean, it fit me as well, but it has so much stretch in it that it fit her as well. And it was perfect because I made it quite long, because I like my tops long because I'm a tall person. But it was great for her because it completely covered her back and her hips and everything, so it would keep her nice and warm in the winter around those areas where she kind of gets joint pains and stuff. So she loved it, so I gave it to her. So I don't have that anymore to show you either. So I'll, like I said, if I haven't inserted a picture of it already, I'll insert a picture into I will also put a picture in the show notes of that cardigan. Sorry, not cardigan, top. As for learning resources, what I use, mostly YouTube. I don't think I've actually used books to learn knitting techniques. Maybe I've looked up some stitch patterns and stuff in books that I've got, but mostly from YouTube. The main channel I use, and I know I've spoken about this before, is Very Pink Knits. I found that her tutorials are really clear, really easy to understand. She has shorter technique videos for each of the different techniques that she does, and she does overall tutorial videos and things as well. So as for where I get yarn, where I have gotten yarn in the past, I got my first load of yarn when we went to Iran, mostly made in Turkey and almost entirely acrylic. But hey ho, you live, you learn. And it was really cheap as well, to be honest, because stuff is just generally cheaper there for me. And so I bought, you guys are gonna laugh, I did the maths on it, because clearly I like counting numbers. I bought over 10,000 meters worth of yarn, so that's over 10 kilometers of yarn. And everyone was like, oh, that's gonna last you, like you're gonna be knitting for a year with that. I think I pretty much had used it all up within about 6 months. Yeah. Anyway, so 2 months after that, we went to New York in June, and I bought almost an equal amount of yarn in New York, and I'm actually using the last of it on my Persistence is Key cardigan that I've been talking about for the last few weeks. But I pretty much used up most of that yarn a few months ago, other than these last couple of balls and some scraps. Then we went to South Africa in August. We flew into Cape Town, and we basically drove across the south coast to Port Elizabeth and one of the national parks around there, Addo National Park, and then we flew back to Cape Town before flying back home to Dubai. And we spent a couple of days in Cape Town initially, and that first evening we went to the waterfront shopping centre. We were wandering past, we went for dinner, and then we were walking past I can't remember what it was called now, I think it was like this warehouse thing. And Perry was like, oh look, let's go look in there, it's like an arts and crafts warehouse thing. We popped our heads in, and at first I was just like, oh okay, I see what it is. It's not so much craft supplies, it's more people selling crafts that they've made. We were like, okay, well let's just walk around and see what there is, and we'll, it might be interesting anyway. It'll be interesting anyway. I'm not expecting to find yarn in here. Anyway, so we walk past, we're walking around, and then suddenly Perry stops and he's like, oh look, there's a ball of yarn in that bowl. Turn around, and sure enough, there was like a small bowl about this big with like a couple of balls of yarn in it. I was like, oh okay, that's nice, I'll go have a look at those, see what there is. And there's a few different colours and whatever. And then there was loads of these scarves, like these knitted like mohair and all different types of scarves hanging from the front of this, and they were like little booths. They weren't proper shops, they were little booths, and so you couldn't really see past it. And then we finally found where the little entrance was and sort of pushed the scarves aside to walk in, and it was my first experience in a place that had proper yarn, like not acrylic, proper yarn wall to wall in this little tiny booth. And I think because I wasn't expecting to find it there, I didn't know, hadn't done any research. South Africa was supposed to be a non-knitting trip. I wasn't expecting anything, so it wasn't, I was overwhelmed because I had no anticipation of finding it. So we had to leave. After about 10-15 minutes in there, I was like, we have to leave, because I can't think here, I can't think like this. So the overwhelming aspect of it kind of took over the moment, and so yeah, we have to go. We walked around the shopping centre, and I took my time, thought about it, and sort of figured out what I wanted to get. And we went back, and then I bought a few balls of yarn there as well. So that all worked out in the end, and that was the first time I bought some sock yarn, which was really exciting. I think I've told you guys about that before. And I've also bought yarn in Iceland when we went last December, and I've shown you the one project I've made from that so far, which was my Icelandic circular shawl. I have more of it up, I think it's around there. You can see the different colours, which I have another project in mind for, just haven't started that yet. And the other place I've mostly bought yarn from is Love Knitting online, and yeah, I placed my first real order with them last year in October-ish time, and Perry brought that back for me when he had a trip to London, and yeah, so I got that around Christmas time, and I've pretty much knit most of that now. Then I also got yarn from my friend Josie, who dyes up yarn in Dubai. She's probably the only indie dyer in the region who dyes her own yarn, and she does some amazing stuff with yarn. Her yarns are beautiful, and she refers to them as her yarn babies, which is really sweet. And so I've used her yarn to make this trillion scarf or bias shawl, and my strap's gone crazy in the background, which also happens to be my first fingering weight cardigan. So moving on to knitting projects again, my first ever jumper or garment, I guess, other than like shawls and hats and stuff, actual clothes garment, is this top down raglan jumper that I made for myself. And I pretty much knit on this exclusively about 2-3 weeks to finish it. With this one, I learnt a lot about self-striping yarn, in that it self-stripes differently on the body than it does on the sleeves. I mean, that makes so much sense, obviously, because you have much fewer stitches on sleeves than you do in a body. I mean, even here you can see the difference between here before you separate for the sleeves. The stripes are thinner than after. But I still loved it. It's 100% acrylic. It's not the best yarn at all. This is some of the stuff I got in Iran. But I love it because it's my first jumper that I made, and I took this to South Africa and I wore it a lot in South Africa because it was winter there when we went. It got really quite windy in the evenings. And yeah, this one will always be special to me because it was my first. And I learned a lot about gauge and tension and stuff like that knitting this one, which was very useful. Then, my first blanket. Sorry, let me just move some stuff in. This is going to be quite big. So this, again, is all acrylic. It's covered in cat hair, so apologies for that. And this is a red heart pattern, not knit with red heart yarn, but a red heart pattern called Radiance Knit Throw. And it's a centre, I think this was the first thing I've knit in the round, sort of like this, like it's circular in the round. Sorry, it's really big. You can see the different colours here, that's probably easiest. And it's got a subtle sort of cable-y pattern thing there. It's not really a cable, it's like it's a pleat. It's like little pleats in it. And so this was knit with yarn I got in Iran, so it's all acrylic. And I knit this the yarn is all worsted. So this is held double, knit on 9mm needles. I knit this in like a week because it knits so fast, it's just so quick. But now this pretty much lives on Perry's chair that's by his desk because Hugo loves to sleep on that chair, and it was very quickly getting covered in cat fluff. So I draped this over the chair, and whilst the cats still like to sleep on the chair, at least this takes care of fluff getting all over it. So I can sit on the floor for now. Right, next blanket. And the only other blanket I've made is a very small crochet granny square blanket with the leftover bulky yarn I had from Iran that I bought, which I knew I was never going to use for anything else. And this is an acrylic wool blend. It's not 100% acrylic. And this was my first sort of proper crochet project. Probably my only proper crochet project. And you can see this last square in the middle here. I ran out of the navy. I had to do a couple. I had to finish that part off in the yellow. So I'll hold it this way up. So that's that one. And it's not massive. I think it's about 1 meter by 1 meter size. I made this to be a blanket for the cats to use. Because when we were in the apartment in Dubai, I used to have my knitting stuff in the spare room. And the cats would always come and join me and sleep on the bed. And so in an attempt to try and avoid the bed getting completely covered in cat fluff, I thought, oh, if I put this down, maybe they'll want to sleep on this instead of on the bed. No, they don't like it. They don't like this one. They just sleep around it. Oh well. Such is life. Then I made my first successful hat. I had made a couple of hats before, but I don't really consider them successful because there was either something wrong with it or I didn't like how it turned out or whatever. But my first successful hat was this one. I'll show you this. And it's the wavy moss slouchy hat. I'll put it on to show you. And yeah, I really like how this one came out. You knit the cable band first, and you seam it together, and then you pick up stitches and knit the hat in a seed stitch. You do the decreases. It's the slouchy version. I really like how this one came out. And then I also did my very first feral hat, which is this one. So I used this variegated colour as the contrast, so it changes colour itself. It just makes it look more complicated than it is. And this pattern, it was actually written to be knit flat. And I changed it, I adapted it to knit it in the round, which isn't really a hard change to do. I think there was 1 or 2 extra stitches added because it was knit flat for seaming, which I took out and then just did it in the round, because who wants the pearl in feral? I mean, really? But I love how this one turned out as well. Then I did what could technically be described as my very first pair of socks, sort of. They were cottage slippers. They're really bulky. And, sorry, I need to take this off. It's getting quite warm in here. I did a pair of cottage slippers with the super bulky yarn, the same yarn that I used for that crochet blanket. And so they were knit on 9mm needles. And the pattern I followed was written for DPNs, but I didn't have DPNs. So I figured it out with magic loop, but I didn't actually know that was what it was called at the time. I kind of just figured it out as I went along and later realised that it's called magic loop. So I did those. They were top down, one at a time, like heel and gusset and all that. Hated it. I hated the experience of knitting like that, and ever since I've knitted all my socks going forward, toe up, 2 at a time. Because they turned out completely different sizes and different lengths. Like I think one had an extra couple of rows on the leg or something, and I didn't realise until after I'd bound off. They were slippers, they weren't a big deal, but I just didn't like the construction that way, and it's kind of put me off knitting like that since. And I striped them, because of course I stripe everything. But my mum has those now. I'll insert a picture, and I'll put a picture in the show notes. But I gave those to my mum because she wanted them. So of course I gave them to her. Then, my first fingering weight shawl is the Pluma shawlette, which I love. I love this shawl because it's soft, it's squishy, and it just has so many memories for me. It's the first fingering weight shawl. It's the yarn I bought in South Africa. It's written to be knit in one colour, and of course I striped it because that's what I do. Probably the first pattern, other than the striping, that I've knit exactly as written. And it was the first time I did a picot bind off, which whilst it took absolutely forever, it was totally worth it. Sorry, the landscaping people are just working outside and watering the plants in the compound, and they're right outside the window here, so if you can hear something that sounds like water, then I apologise. I can't control when they do their jobs. So that's that one. It's a Manos del Uruguay pattern, free on Ravelry. Then, oh, another thing, going back to the whole making stuff up and whatever, my brother asked me, I think somewhat jokingly, if I could make him a balaclava. But he had a very specific balaclava in mind. So, I don't know if you've seen the film Spring Breakers. I haven't watched it myself, but he sent me a picture from me of the balaclavas they wear. I think they're pink. And he wanted something like that, but obviously in a different colour, not pink. and he asked me if I could make him one, and I was like, well, I'll see what I can find, or if I can, or whatever. I made no promises. I went looking online, and I couldn't find any balaclava patterns. I could find very few balaclava patterns in the first place, but I couldn't find any that had eye holes and a mouth hole. Most of them had like either the mouth completely covered and just like a slit open for the eyes, or it was the whole face was uncovered. There wasn't one that had 3 separate holes, which was the kind that he wanted. I'm not entirely sure why, but anyway, so I found the closest thing I could and then basically made it up from there. I kind of took the measurement, not the measurements, but the stitch counts and the gauge and stuff like that, took that into consideration based on this other pattern, and then just sort of measured it against myself. My brother sent me his head measurements and stuff, and quite similar to mine, so I was able to try it on and check and make sure it fit. And thankfully it worked, and he loved it. So I'll insert a picture of that as well. Yes, and then into talking about gauge, I made a hat, and it was designed to be knit in worsted weight, and I used the right size needles. And usually with hats I get gauge with the right needles, with the needles recommended, and the yarn, it's usually close enough. But I, for some reason, decided to hold the yarn double, and completely forgot the fact that holding the yarn double is going to change the thickness of the yarn, and therefore it's going to affect the gauge. So this hat turned out huge, like ginormous huge. So big, I folded up the rim and I've turned it into a yarn bowl. Because what else are you going to do with an oversized hat? I didn't really want to rip it out. I was not overly fond of the yarn in the first place. It was, I mean, I actually quite like the yarn, but it is mostly acrylic. But I didn't want to rip it out. And I quite like it as a bowl. Holds some nice yarn. So at least it's useful. There's a lesson on gauge there. If you want to know a bit more about gauge and knitting maths and stuff, Maria Stitched in Sweden recently did a really good episode talking about that and going into more detail about it. Then my first fingering weight socks, my first sock weight socks are these. Now, nothing fancy with these socks. The yarn isn't anything fancy. I can't even remember what the brand is because I lost the ball band. They're a bit dusty. We need a wash. I knit these on 3mm needles, which was too big, but I didn't have anything smaller at the time. They've got ladders. I don't know if you can see that. You can see the laddering there. And they're not perfect. They're too big. They're too baggy around the foot and stuff, but they're comfortable and they're great for house socks, so I wear them around the house all the time. And yeah, I quite like the pattern too. So I've got 2 of those. I started knitting these before we left for Iceland. I took them with me when we went to Iceland. I knit them in Iceland and I finished them on the plane back from Iceland. I find whilst I take knitting with me on holiday, I don't actually knit that much whilst on holiday. I knit more on the plane there and plane back, on the flight there and back. I tend to try not to knit too much when I'm on holiday, especially if it's just me and Perry, because whilst I can chat and stuff while knitting, I'm not paying 100% of my attention. So especially when we're traveling, we're on holiday and stuff, and especially last year, we did quite a number of driving holidays. So it's nice to actually be present in the moment, if that makes sense, and like look out the window and see what's going on. And I also really like taking pictures and photography, so it was like the knitting would take a back seat whilst actually on holiday, and I would take more pictures and kind of really soak in the experience, I guess, if that makes sense. So that's why this didn't get that much done on it. Otherwise it probably would have been done whilst we were in Iceland. I was kind of hoping to finish them whilst we were there so I could actually wear them, but it's okay. Broken foot and everything would have probably meant I weren't going to wear them anyway. Broken leg, I mean. Then my first all-over lace garment, and frankly I think this probably counts as the only all-over proper lace garment, is my Camellia Dolman. which I showed you in my first episode, which is beautiful. I love it. And it's a a kid mohair wool blend. Don't know how well you can see the pattern. Sorry, the lighting's going funny. Because of the colours, I think. But anyway, it's basically a circle that you knit flat because you don't knit it in the round. So you have so it's knit back and forth. So that's a lot of purling. Can you imagine by the end of it, there were like 600-700 stitches on this thing. But I knit it. It took me about 3 weeks of religious knitting on this, but I got there. It's back in my monogamous knitting days. And then cabled hats. I really enjoy doing cables, and I've done quite a few projects with cables. And then whilst I was at home and in bed with a broken leg, I found some cable patterns that I liked online and basically just made hats out of them. No real patterns written up for these. Like I said, I just took a cable pattern that I liked, figured out the numbers, how to get a certain number of full repeats, and worked it out from there. This is one. So this one doesn't have any, you know how usually with cables you get a section of pearls in between to kind of really make the cable pop? This one doesn't have that. This one is just stocking it all the way around with cable twists. I love the variegation of this yarn. This is a bulky yarn that I got from Love Knitting. I can't actually remember the name of it, but I have ordered more of this one. Move this back so you can see it better. So it's not quite a tight beanie, but it's not a slouch either. And I love the big pom-poms. I have a thing for pom-poms on my hats. Sorry, go back again for this one. This one's my favourite. I love the colour on this one. Just love that blue with the purple. And again, the big pom-pom. The pom-pom on this one turned out better. This one's a bit more of a slouchy hat depending on how you wear it. It's a little bit more slouchy than the other one. And this cable does have the pearls in between, so this one really pops on the hat. I really like that cable stitch. So there's a couple of cable patterns, and this moves on nicely to wire designing. I don't know if you've gathered from what I've shown you so far, but I do alter patterns a lot. I make them my own, I adapt them. Sometimes I just use them as a baseline to start from and then go from there and do my own thing. So yeah, I find that from the very beginning, my very first project, that stupid cowl turned bag thing, that I rarely follow a pattern as written. I'm always adapting them, and so designing my own patterns was kind of almost an inevitability. Like I said, I've already designed a few things without even thinking about it. Like the balaclava for my brother. I made some fingerless mitts for my mum. The pattern I followed was terribly written, and it turned out massively oversized. Again, I have the first one that I knit somewhere. And I was just like, my mum has small hands. I have big hands for a person. Like, my hands are the same size as Perry's. Like, I have man-sized hands. Which is fine, doesn't bother me. But my mum has tinier hands than me. And this fingerless mitt, the first one I knit, was too big for me. I don't know what was wrong with the pattern. I was getting gauge. I checked my gauge on the thing as well. I was using the same size needles. I was using the same weight yarn. I was getting gauge. I'm not entirely sure what happened there, but they didn't fit. They were too big. So I went back and I recalculated based on my gauge the number of stitches I would need to make a fingerless mitt that would fit my mum's hand. I got her to measure her hand for me and all of that, and I basically rewrote the pattern to work properly. So I knit my mum a pair of fingerless mitts. So it's things like that I've always been doing since I started knitting without really thinking too much about it. It wasn't so much oh, this doesn't work, okay, I'll find something else. It doesn't work, well, how do I make it work? You know, so I think I've just always had that mentality with my knitting. Is like, if something's not working, then find a way to make it work. And so yeah, so I guess then progressing from that and things like these hats where I just found a stitch pattern that I liked and worked out the maths to make it work into a hat, is a natural progression then to move on to purposefully designing stuff, or garments and shawls and whatever. Like, I think I'm probably a long way off from designing garments and sized items like cardigans and jumpers and things that have to have multiple sizing. I would need to do a lot more learning for something like that. I think that takes a lot more thought. But for something that basically just involves coming up with stitch patterns and figuring out, doing basic knitting math and stuff like that, I really enjoy that. And so, as I said, it was a natural progression to move on to. And this is my first shawl design, which I showed in my last episode and is now in the process of being test knit. Test knitters have just started on this one. Sorry, I was holding Hugo whilst filming the last episode and it's now covered in cat fluff. But such is life. I really love this. I really love the lace on this one. As I mentioned before, you can't really see it in the shot at the moment, but the last few rows are knit in garter stitch. Let me see if I show it to you better up front. The last few rows are in garter stitch, which means when you get to the longest part of the shawl, the most number of stitches, you don't have to do any purling. Love it so much, and I can't wait. And I probably have already started knitting the my second version of this one in the colourway that Mel from the Yarn Tree has dyed up for it. So I'm excited about that too. And yeah, so I guess I have lots of ideas now as well. Now that I've designed a couple of things, I've got this one and I've got my Delayed Departures cowl, which has been released. And that's really exciting. I have loads of other ideas running around my head, and I'm starting to, when something comes to me, I jot it down and make a quick note of like a stitch pattern that comes to mind or something, and then sort of put it aside until I'm ready to come back to it. I have a few ideas for hats, a couple of Fair Isle designs that I'm thinking about, and just things like that really. So I'm really quite excited to see where this goes. Yeah, and I guess our move to Bahrain was really the push I needed. I say push, but it was really the catalyst for me deciding to start a podcast, because I wasn't working full time anymore. My leg had healed, so I wasn't incapable of getting around. And I was starting over again, so it seemed like a good opportunity. And it was a good way to get in touch and get to know some new knitters, well, new to me knitters, and get involved with the online knitting community, which is such a wonderful place. There's so many lovely people. And so yeah, the last thing I wanted to talk about was some new to me techniques and things that I'd like to learn how to do. The first being steeking. I really want to, get on with it and actually steek something, because I really want to learn that technique. I mean, I understand the technique and I've read lots of tutorials and watched lots of videos about it, and I get it, and I will probably steek on a sewing machine, because I have a sewing machine and I feel more confident in that than I do with crochet. Because I always feel like, ooh, crochet, it could come undone maybe, or something, I'm not sure. I don't know, maybe it's just me being funny about it. But I'll probably start with like a baby sweater or baby cardigan or something. Not that I'm expecting a baby, or I know anyone who's having a baby before anyone jumps to conclusions, because people always do. But just because it's a small item, it's a quick knit, and I won't feel too bad if it gets messed up and it doesn't work out, because I haven't invested too much time or yarn into the object. So maybe that's what I'll do. I'll knit up a small baby sweater, and if it does work out, then I have a baby sweater for whoever has a baby next. So I think that's probably something I'll work on after we get back from London. And so other things, other than steeking, on the same sort of note of steeking, I want to learn how to sew in a zipper into a steeked cardigan, or into any cardigan. Like the Persistence is Key cardigan that I'm knitting at the moment is has an option for adding a zipper rather than doing a button band. I mean, as part of the button band rather than adding buttons. And that really appeals to me as well. Like, I like the idea of doing that for that, especially because it's a worsted weight jacket, I think it would work better with a zipper, and I think buttons would end up being with the weight of the sweater, it wouldn't work as nicely, or you'd need really substantial buttons for it. So I haven't fully decided on that one yet. If I can find a good zipper for it, then that's probably what I'll do. Give it a go with that one. And finally, the last thing I really want to try is using beads in my knitting. I've never used beads with knitting. I vaguely understand the concept of how that would work. I guess you either have to string it onto your yarn before you start, or you have to add it onto your yarn whilst you're knitting with a crochet hook. But as I said, I've never tried it myself, so I'd have to do more research before doing something like that. But it is something I'm interested in learning how to do as well. And of course, I always want to do more colour work. I have all these pretty colours up there that are begging to become colour work projects. So yeah, so I'm looking forward to working on those sorts of things. And so let me know if you have any questions about anything that I've talked about. I'm going to try and put as many things as I can remember to put into the show notes, and hopefully that will be as exhaustive as possible. But yeah, do let me know if you have any questions. There is a question and answer thread on the Ravelry group, so you can always ask me questions there. You can send me a private message or write a comment on the thread for this episode. And yeah, like always, I'm always happy to hear from viewers. I love hearing from you guys. And so yeah, please come join the group if you haven't already joined. I'll see you over there, and have a good week and happy knitting. Bye.